you could be leaving hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in the ATO's pocket instead of yours, and it is so easy to get back. So that's what we're going to cover in this video, particularly in regard to independent support workers. Before we get too far into this video, I'd like to invite you to subscribe. We are a channel dedicated completely to independent support providers or independent support workers. So if that is you, please hit subscribe so that we can keep bringing you these hopefully informative videos. So GST, especially with regard to independent support workers, can be a bit of a confusing topic. I'm sure a lot of people know what GST is. They probably don't quite understand exactly how it works, and especially when it comes to business, how it comes to claiming and paying GST. So in this video, we're going to make it a whole lot clearer. We're going to look at whether you need to register, whether you should register, how to claim the GST, and whether you need to actually collect and pay any GST. So before we get into it, remember that I'm not a tax or financial or legal professional or advisor. All of this is for educational and informational purposes. If you have any questions or want to do this yourself, please go and seek professional advice from your accountant or somebody else, somebody who can preferably take your personal circumstances into account. So the easiest part to tackle first is whether or not you need to register for GST. Now, for the most part, this comes down to one key point, which is whether or not your gross revenue minus any GST is going to exceed $75,000 per year. Now, if you're just starting out as an independent support worker, then that $75,000 is whether or not you think you will earn that this year. If you're an existing independent support worker who in previous years hasn't met the threshold, so you haven't registered, then it comes down to whether or not you believe you're going to reach that threshold this year. And basically, once you realize you're going to reach that threshold, that's the point when you should register. Again, personal circumstances, go and seek help from an accountant when it comes down to actually timing this and making sure that you're doing it right. So basically, how do we figure out whether we need to register? We essentially have our income like this, and we're going to chop off any GST. Now, if you're an independent support worker, there's a really good chance you don't pay any GST or collect any GST, I should say, and I'm going to go further into that later. But you would chop any GST that you have collected off, and then if this portion, the X GST portion, is greater than 75,000, then good news, bad news, you need to register. So that's pretty easy. Now, there is a couple of other circumstances where you will have to register, but from what I believe, none of them really come into account for an independent support worker if that's your only business. They come into account for other things, other professions. So now we know whether you have to register, but if you don't have to register, before you click off this video, understand that there may be a pretty good point to actually registering voluntarily prior to reaching the threshold, or even if you aren't going to reach the threshold, because there's no real penalty for registering before you reach the threshold. There's only a penalty for not registering when you should have. And obviously don't claim any GST back when you're not meant to. So this is another thing where when it comes to tax time and doing your BAS, make sure that you talk to your accountant and double check all of your eligibility. By the way, before we get into this next bit, we have a Facebook group on Facebook, believe it or not. And it's actually a community that we're trying to build with independent support workers where we can all share advice, share tips and tricks, etc. So if you want to become a part of that community, it doesn't have participants, it doesn't have large providers, it doesn't have other businesses that are constantly trying to sell to you. It's just independent support providers so that you can share advice, ask questions, talk about rates and rule changes and things like that, and make sure that you're on top of everything. And it's also where these videos and the research and things that we do will also get posted in there so that you can take a look at that and constantly keep yourself up to date on pretty much the ever-changing rules, and especially at the moment, the ever-changing rules of the NDIS. So I'll leave a link for that in the description. Make sure to check it out. We'd love to see you there. So we'll just rub this out real quick and we'll look at how GST works for a normal business and then how that equates to independent support workers. And this will sort of highlight why you might be able to, or why you should potentially register for GST, whether or not you're going to reach the threshold. So a normal business has their product like so, and they sell that product for $110. Now they are required to register for GST. So 1/11 of that is going to be the GST amount. So that amount is going to be $10 GST. And then the business pockets the $100, and then they pay all of their expenses and taxes and wages and everything else out of that. But the $10 off the top is the GST, so 1/11. So that's how it works for normal business. But then when that normal business goes and they buy a product off somebody else for the business, they pay $110, $10 of which is GST, $100 of which is the product, and then they claim the business percentage of this $10 back when it comes to BAS time. So if their business percentage is 100%, then they claim a $10 refund on their BAS. And over here, they collected $10, and so they have $10 collected, $10 paid, and so their BAS would be $0. So how does that equate for independent support workers? Well, most NDIS supports are GST free, and I say most. There are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, if you're providing things like community access, if you're providing core supports, honestly, a lot of other ones, they are GST exempt. Now, it gets a little bit tricky as to whether or not you are GST exempt, or the support codes that you're providing are GST exempt, and you want to ask your accountant, because it does actually come down to reading and understanding the tax code. That's not my profession. We went and spoke to our accountant for this, and they assured us that our support codes that we were providing were GST free, and so we were happy with that. But as I said, according to the ATO and the NDIS, most and almost always NDIS support codes are GST free. So what that means for you is we'll come up with a fictional hourly rate of $110, so that it equates to our product up the top, and it's nice, easy math for me. And so if you're GST exempt, that means that you no longer take that $10 off the top and you get the full $110. However, if you're registered for GST, what it means is you go and pay $110 over here. Maybe you filled your car up with fuel, and there's a $10 GST and then $100 for the fuel. Well, come tax time, you claim the business percentage of the $100 off your income tax, but you get this $10 refund. Hey, hi, hello, it's me from the future. I realized that I didn't explain this part very well, so I'm going to redo it here for you. So with our fictional thing here, we have our $110 per hour that we charged, and we got that $110 in our pocket because we are providing GST free supports and we are registered for GST, or whether or not we're registered for GST, it would not matter. So we get our $110. Now we go and we fill up our car for $110, very convenient. And there is a $10 GST and a $100 amount of fuel. So all very easy there. Now, when it comes down to how much we paid, how much we claim, what I said in the original clip was a little bit misleading because I didn't explain the business percentage part. So let's imagine that your car business percentage that you use it based on your logbook or however you're calculating it is 75%. That would mean that the amount that you claim on your income tax would be 75% of $100, which is $75. And it would also mean that you claim 75% of the GST as a GST refund, which would be $7.50. not claiming the percentage of this one and getting a full GST refund on this one, which I think is, I must have got a little bit mixed up in the business percentage that I was thinking of in the original clip. So whatever your business percentage is, whether it be 75 or 85 or 95 or 100%, that is the part that you use for claiming your portion of the $100 and your portion of the GST $10 or however much it is. All right, so I hope that clears that up. Back to the video. So when you add up all those costs over the year, just if you're just paying for things like your registration, your insurance, your fuel, your liability insurance, etc., subscriptions, for example, Careroo or QuickBooks or Xero, any of those things, you're going to pay GST on those things generally. And then when it comes down to BAS time, you're going to be able to claim that as a refund, probably. Again, speak to your accountant about exact eligibility and amounts and things like that, but that is generally speaking how it's going to work. So even if you're only doing, say, $50,000 a year or $40,000 or $60,000, you may want to talk to your accountant about registering for this purpose, because all the services you provide are GST free, or generally speaking, but the things you are buying for your business have GST on them, and you very well could be eligible to claim that GST back and get, $1,000 back or $2,000 back or whatever it is each year. And then it really starts to kick in when you, for example, have to upgrade your car, and you might pay $2,500 in GST on the car. And so you can then, again, speak to your accountant, but claim the GST back on that car purchase. And when it comes to big things like that, there are different rules about when and how much you can claim in a year. But those are times when obviously you don't want to just hand over $2,500. If you can get that $2,500 back perfectly legally, no dodgy stuff going on, you're not doing tax evasion or any fun stuff like that. So you might as well put it back in your pocket and use it for you and your family instead of just handing it to the ATO as free money. So now that we know whether we need to register, and we perhaps have a better idea of whether we should register even if we don't need to, let's have a look at how you actually organize GST when it comes to invoices and expenses. Because for people who aren't numbers inclined, this can be a little bit tricky, but it's nice and simple, and so I'll show you in the next couple of minutes. All right, so I've logged into my Careroo account, and I'm going to add an invoice. And so where we select our GST and how this all operates is we first select our product or service, and that's going to pre-fill all of this. And then down the bottom here, this is on an iPad, on a desktop, or on a mobile. It'll, all look slightly different, but there's a GST field at the end. And so we want to select that, and we can either select that it has GST or whether it's GST free. Nice and simple. There's no 7 million options or anything like that, because it's all very simple for us. So if we choose GST, you'll see that we have here that our total would be $59.06 because it's $59.06 and a quantity of 1. $59.06 with $5.37 of GST. And if we choose GST free, it's $59.06 with $0 GST. So really simple. And then when it comes down to expenses, if we add an expense and we'll put in here fuel, and we'll put in $110. There we go. So as you can see, we've got GST selected. We put our amount at 110, so that comes up to a subtotal of 100, GST of 10, total of 110. And if we changed this to exclusive, then it would be subtotal of 110, GST of 11, total of 121. So generally speaking, you leave that as inclusive, because almost always when you're purchasing things in Australia, the GST is included in the price, except for specific B2B type services where sometimes it's exclusive and then they either add it on, or if you're exempt, there's some arrangement there. So that is how you keep track of your GST in something like Careroo. And then we also have this business percentage slider here. So makes it really simple when, for example, your fuel, if you know that your logbook equates to about a 75% or 85% usage, you can just come in here and set that, so 85. And now when we look at your profit and loss and things like that, it'll know that this expense was 85% for business use. All right, so very easy, very simple to keep track of your GST during the tax year. Basically, just make sure that you choose the right option when you're invoicing and the right option when you are tracking your expenses. So let's summarize and make sure that we've covered everything in this video. So we were going to look at whether you need to register. So basically that comes down to whether your income is greater than 75,000, and that is business income, by the way. So if you have, for example, you do your independent support work and then you maybe do a bit of part-time employment at a larger provider, or you work down at Coles or whatever you might do, don't include the employment income in that calculation. It is just what your business brings in. So if that's greater than 75,000, then you will need to register in most cases. Then we looked at whether you perhaps should register even if you don't have to, and that's because if you are getting paid $110 an hour, for example, you're collecting $0 GST on that. However, if you go and pay $110 for your fuel, you are paying $10 GST, and then so come tax time, you can get that as a $10 refund. And then as that adds up and adds up and adds up and adds up, or if you go and purchase a new car, you end up with potentially hundreds, potentially even thousands of eligible GST refund. And then the next things we were going to look at were how you collect and claim GST. So collecting GST was on your invoices. You select either GST or GST free. And that'll make sure that the GST portion shows up on the invoice. And it'll also make sure that whatever software you're using knows that there's GST in that calculation. And so when it's doing your reports and things, it knows how much GST is there, how much you've paid, how much you've collected. Same with expenses. You choose GST or GST free, and then it knows how much you've actually paid on all of these expenses. And you can also choose your business portion if it's in something like Careroo. So I believe we've covered all that. We've got whether you need to register, whether you should register, how you collect and how you claim GST. And you should probably now have a general idea of how that GST system works, at least specifically for you. So now that you've saved yourself a GST headache, make sure that you are actually covered if somebody was to slip, trip or fall, or potentially if you were to break something or hurt somebody while you're on the job. Because bear in mind, if you're a sole trader like most of us, if something happens, the liability is on you. And so there's specific things to cover you for that called liability insurance. And that's what our next video is coming out on. So make sure to subscribe so that you are notified when that comes out. And join us over on Facebook, where we'll also be posting it there. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.